Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Andrew Beer. I'm the concertmaster of the Auckland Philharmonia Orchestra, and it's a great privilege to be part of this competition. Many thanks to Sir Michael Hill and Anne Rodda for having me here. And I'd also like to introduce Alexandra Lomeko, who is the winner of the New Zealand Development Prize this year at the competition. She's very graciously agreed to perform some of the most difficult passages from Paganini Caprices for us this morning. It's really lovely to be here in Queenstown. It's such a beautiful place. Your roads scare me a little bit, though. It's not easy driving. So to talk about Paganini and why it's such a great selection for a violin competition, when we think about Paganini's place in the history of violin playing and music performance in general, long before the Beatles, long before Elvis, even before Franz Liszt, Paganini essentially created the cults of the performer. He was the first musical superstar in the world. He had a lot of methods in which he created this, sort of led to his legend. Probably his most shameless trick was to come on stage with at least one of his strings really badly frayed, so it would be ready to break. So he'd put his bow on the string, play a couple notes, it would break right away. He'd pretend to be really surprised that that happened, and then he'd play the rest of the concert with only 3 strings. But really his most lasting legacy is the difficulty of his music. So today we're just going to explore what makes it so difficult, some of the new techniques that he introduced for the violin. And the 24 Caprices that he wrote is a great compendium of a lot of these techniques. So we've selected 4 Caprices to show you today. And I tried to be fair by choosing some of the ones that were selected by most candidates in this competition, and we had a grand winner in that sense, which is Caprice number 11. There were 2 other Caprices that 2 candidates chose. Actually, 5 people chose number 11. I think the reason might be that it shows a broader variety than a lot of the other Caprices. We have a lyrical section, and then we have a really fast virtuoso section. So let's jump right into the beginning of Caprice number 11. This starts with a beautiful melody. The challenge here is to play the melody in a legato or connected way, but to also play 3-note chords. As you know, our bridges on the violin are curved, so it's not possible to sustain more than 2 notes at once. So every time we play a new note, we have to roll the chord. We also have passages of quite a redundant nature. To be honest, Paganini was perhaps the best violinist to ever live. We don't really know. There's no recordings of Paganini. Considering how much he advanced violin technique, it's easy to believe he was the greatest. Not the world's greatest composers. A lot of repetitive passages in the music, and this is where artistry comes in, where the creativity of the musician needs to come to the foreground. So if we could just play this next passage once, very straight, without any manipulation of time, quite boring. So we hear that the music goes to a high C 3 times in a row. Now, what a more creative artist might do. We also have great intonation challenges, the challenge of making the notes match each other when we have double or triple stops. And we have something called perfect intervals on the violin. The intervals which occur in overtones here is the most in nature. If we have your octave, 5th, 4th. So these intervals are the ones that must be absolutely perfect. And when it's just a little bit out of tune, the judges hear it very clearly. So in this passage, we have some perfect 4ths. That was really great. That's not easy to do. Thank you. So let's listen to that in the context of the passage, how the 4ths blend in. The music then proceeds to a presto section. This is the fast virtuosic section of the piece. It's interesting to see how many different interpretations there are of this music. If we think of Nathan Milstein, the great old violinist, he plays this at 76 to the quarter note, very steady, quite classy. On the other end of the spectrum, we have someone like Markov, who's probably the living representative of Paganini. He looks quite like him. He's very tall, skinny, long hair, flowing hair when he plays, and he plays really wild, sort of at this tempo. This part of the piece also poses intonation challenges. Even though only one note is being played at a time, there are chords underneath which are implied in each bar. So for the next example, we're going to have Alexandra play 4 bars, and I'm going to play the chords underneath on the piano. Just listen to how every note she plays needs to match those chords. And this happens throughout the piece, so in every moment you have to be aware of those chords and really matching the intonation of each note. Let's jump ahead. We talked earlier about a lot of repetitive passages. This one later, example 7, it goes on, and when it's played monotonously, you sort of lose the interest of the audience.
Is it boring here?
What's that?
It's the boring version.
This is the boring version. Now that passage is going through a lot of different musical keys, tone centers, and a creative performer might try and color each key slightly differently. Another challenge in this caprice has to do with string crossings. As you know, we have 4 strings on the violin. Paganini loved to do jumps, where he would jump from a lower string to a higher string, skipping one in the middle. So in this passage, we go from the G to the A strings. It's quite a workout for the right arm. And finally, we come to the most difficult passage in this piece, sort of combines some of the elements we've seen already, jumping of strings, perfect intervals required in the octaves, fifths and fourths, and some really big shifts when we're jumping the left hand around. Thank you. Now we'll jump to caprice number 17. Which is a caprice that 2 candidates have chosen in this competition. This is a great start to this one. There's a lot to show right away. We start with what's called a unison, when we're playing the same note on 2 strings. So it's a double stop, except it's not, because the same note is sounding twice. This is tricky because it's the very beginning of the caprice, and it's easy to play it out of tune, which might sound like this. Not good. Or in tune. Not easy. Yes, that's immediately followed by triple stops, as we heard in Caprice 11. That's when you play 3 notes at once on 3 different strings. That's followed by a passage with a very fast descending scale. And then finally some octave leaps, where we again have to go very high up with the left hand. So that's a lot of different technical challenges. right in the first 20 seconds of the piece. Listen to how it all links together. Also listen to how the fermatas, how the pauses in the music increase the drama of this section. Then we step right into the main section of this piece, which the character is intended to be quite humorous, actually. It's a little bit silly. And as we know, great humor has to do with timing. So if we listen to this passage played very straight, it doesn't really work. And now with charm added through the timing of the music. Thank you. Alexander also played with the music with the articulation. Some notes would be quite long, others short. That's really great to hear the creativity from the performers, and that's what judges might be looking for here. The most famous section of this piece is employing something called fingered octaves. Octaves are when we play two notes, 8 notes apart. That's why it's called octave. It's the same note, but an octave apart. Again, the intonation is very challenging here. It has to match. Usually when we play octaves slowly, we'll use a fingering of 1-4-1-4. This is the easiest to play in tune. If you could just show it this passage really slowly with that fingering.
The whole passage or one part?
As you wish. Thank you. This actually doesn't work at full tempo here. The reason is that with that fingering you have to shift every note. Shifting, moving the left hand from one place to another. So what we do is a trick called fingered octaves. Instead of 1-4-1-4, we use 1-3 followed by 2-4, which means that you have to shift every other note instead of every note. But the challenge is that this is a real stretch for the left hand. It's almost impossible to get it perfectly in tune, but it's the compromise we have to make. Let's see how the passage sounds that way. Thank you. That's really brave to play that cold like that. Thank you, Alexander. Now let's jump to the 21st Caprice. This is the other Caprice that 2 candidates have chosen to play. This sort of shows a different style, and here we hear the influence of Rossini, the opera composer, of course, the most famous Italian composer of the day, and his bel canto style, as we would hear in his arias. And we use double stops, 2 notes at once, in intervals of sixths that sound like that. The idea here is to be very lyrical, to make a sustained sound like a singer. And the challenge becomes more extreme later in this passage. We have some thirds, which are the opposite of sixths, also difficult intervals to play. Very challenging, a lot of shifts. Somehow we have to keep it lyrical, sort of hide how difficult it is. It's acting on stage, essentially. And then to end this caprice, we have a presto section employing something called up staccato, which is where we play a lot of notes really quickly in one direction. That's an up bow, and there's a break between every note. Heifetz probably made this technique the most famous. He might have been the best at it of all time. He had that piece, Hora Staccato. You've probably heard that one before. I just cheated right now. I changed my bow direction on every note. That's not up staccato. Up staccato looks more like this, slowly. It's a great challenge for the right hand to engage and release on every note. Do you want to just play the passage slowly once from this caprice? And then the challenge is bringing that up to a quicker tempo. Bravo. And to wrap up Paganini, we'll end with the 24th Caprice. This is probably the most famous, with the melody that goes like this. It's been used in a lot of other music. If you think about the Rachmaninoff set of variations for piano and orchestra based on that theme. And this is a great summary of all 24 caprices. What Paganini does is, using variation form, each variation shows techniques used in some of the previous caprices. And then he actually ends with, not ends, but near the end of the piece, he introduces one new technique that's not been used in any of the other caprices. And we're going to end with that technique. First of all, to review just a few of the ones we've seen already. This is a slower version of up bow staccato. And then we have some slow lyrical intervals. This time it's octaves rather than thirds or sixths. We also have some fast descending semitones quite high up. This is one of those variations that's actually harder than it sounds, especially if you're nervous and you're sweating, your fingers get quite sticky and it's hard to navigate the fingerboard. The most infamous and difficult passage in this caprice is variation 6, where we have some falling thirds followed by rising tenths in double stops. Besides the point that you have to shift on every note, move the left hand on every note, the intervals are changing. So sometimes they're major tenths, sometimes they're minor tenths. So not only are you moving up really quickly, but you're changing the distance between the two fingers on each note. Maybe just play that super slow once. Yeah. A lot of people sort of cheat in this section. What they do is, because at full tempo it goes so fast, it's a little bit hard for the listener to hear every note. So what they might do is play the first and last notes longer and really try and make sure those two notes are in tune and kind of fudge everything else in between. You'd be surprised how many people do that. I do it too. Yeah. And finally we come to the new technique. This is something called left hand pizzicato. As we know, pizzicato usually is done with the right hand. Sort of makes a violin sound like a guitar. In this case, besides the point that the left hand is putting the fingers on the string, we also pull away to make a plucking sound with our left hand. And this rotates with the use of the bow in sort of a percussive manner. It's hitting the string to try and imitate the pizzicato. And when we put the two together, it sounds like this. Thank you. So that sort of summarizes some of the things we look for in Paganini. And thanks again to Alexandra. It was really brave of you to do all that. Now I've just got a bit more time, and I also wanted to very briefly touch on the Salon Pieces that candidates have been asked to play today throughout the competition. And what judges might be looking for in this piece is a little bit different. These Salon Pieces, technically speaking, are not nearly as challenging as the Paganini caprices. So it's more about style and charm. And I'll just talk really briefly about some of the technical things we can do to help with that. So to take one example, the piece that's been most chosen for the Salon piece is the Tchaikovsky melody from Souvenir d'un lieu cher, which is French for memory of a dear place. Now the melody in this piece goes like this. Seems quite simple. E flat major, a couple of C flats thrown in for good measure. One of the keys, and I tell this to my students all the time, it drives them nuts, but it's really important, is knowing the harmonies that are going on in the background. So if we listen to what the piano part's doing in this section, we might get a clue as to how to phrase this melody. So I'm not going to bore you with a lot of harmonic analysis, but I think we can all hear that there's a lot going on there. As the chords change, the mood or the character, the color might change as well. And then when we hear that as a violinist, we try and change possibly the speed of our vibrato, going faster or slower, the density of the bow, we might push forward or fall back in a certain section. So hearing those chords, one might play the melody like this instead. We also have a lot of repeated note passages in this piece where we'll play one note over and over again. The challenge here again is to do something with it rather than playing it really straight. Rather than doing that, a candidate would definitely play with the time. They would also switch fingers on the same note. Even though it's the same note, we can switch fingers and slide into it for more color. Something like this. And finally, we have passages where the same music happens exactly 2 times in exactly the same manner. Something like this. But in music, we really never want to play something identically twice. If you think about, as an actor, if you're saying, listen to me, you wouldn't say it the same way, exactly the same twice. You might raise your voice the second time. You might whisper instead. On the violin, to do this, we could change the dynamic. We could play louder or softer. Again, we could slide on a note. That's what I call a high-fit slide. We use the new finger to slide into the new note, or we could do a Kreisler slide, which is dragging the old finger. So listening to the 2 in a row, I'll do a Kreisler slide followed by a high-fit slide. Or we could slide down the first time and up the second time. The choices are nearly endless, but the purpose in these salon pieces is to be creative, to make phrases sound different from each other, and to color the music. So I think we'd better let the candidates come on stage pretty soon. It's been really an honor to speak to you today, and I hope you enjoy the competition. Thank you.